Hello everybody and welcome. Nilma. My name is Professor Kylie Message-Jones and I'm the head of the Humanities Research Centre here at ANU. I'd like to start tonight by acknowledging that we're meeting on unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri lands. I pay my respects to the elders past and present. I also acknowledge all First Nations people who are present here today, both in the audience here in the room with us and also online. I'd like to thank our admin, our IT and our marketing teams, especially Melinda and Neha, for helping out with this event tonight, which has been technically a little bit tricky for all of us. So if there are any issues, please bear with us, but so far they've done an amazing job and we're very, very grateful for their work. So thank you for that. I'd also like to thank our Auslan interpreters, Carolyn and Rebecca on the screen. Thank you very much. Tonight's lecture is going to be recorded and we'll be serving refreshments afterwards. So please stay and have a chat and something to drink. So for those of you who might not be aware of the Humanities Research Centre, I thought I'd just start by telling you a little bit about it. The work that we do at the HRC is committed to advancing the production, dissemination and public translation of outstanding and innovative interdisciplinary scholarship in the humanities. The Centre's mission is to develop, deliver and support various programs and events that build communities of practice around and engagement with interdisciplinary humanities research across the ANU nationally and globally. And of course, when we talk about humanities, we really mean all research that has anything to do with what it means to be human. One of our very favourite programs each year is our internal or faculty fellowships. The faculty fellowship program enables academics from across the College of Arts and Social Sciences to spend a whole semester in the HRC, often with the goal of completing a research project. But they also spend time meeting and engaging with our external fellows and the other researchers who make up the HRC and also our external partners. Many of these fellows continue to be very valued parts of the HRC's intellectual community. Now, I'm mentioning this tonight because our speaker tonight, Dr. Gemma King, was previously one of these internal fellows in 2020 or 2019? 2021, recently. But of course, Gemma was an internal fellow during COVID, so she didn't have as much access to our resources and our people as others might have done. However, she still made the most of it, and she's been a fabulous friend, a brilliant colleague, and an excellent, outstanding collaborator for the HRC well beyond her fellowship. Gemma's also an outstanding scholar who is, as we'll see in her lecture tonight, committed to excellence and research, to excellence in research translation and producing excellent research in equal measure. So I'd like to also start by saying, by way of formal introduction, that Gemma is a senior lecturer in French at the School of Literature, Languages and Linguistics at the ANU. She is author of the books Decentering France, Multilingualism and Power in Contemporary French Cinema, which was published in 2017 by Manchester University Press, and Jacques Audiard, which was published in 2021, also by Manchester University Press. Most recently, Gemma was awarded an Australian Research Council DECRA project for a fellowship for her project Sign on Screen, Language, Culture and Power in Sign Language Cinemas. And she'll be talking a little bit about some of the ideas that will be explored further in that project tonight. So without further delay, I'd like to invite to the podium tonight's speaker for the 2023 HRC Future of the Humanities and Social Sciences lecture, Dr. Gemma King.
Welcome all, and thank you for coming tonight. I want to begin by acknowledging that this presentation is taking place on Aboriginal land, Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I pay my respects to the elders. Always was, always will be. I also want to note that this research is about the cinematic portrayal of the many sign languages of the world, of which the local language here is Auslan. As a hearing person, my perspective can only ever be one of an outsider, or at least an ally. And so I want to thank the many deaf community members, groups, friends and teachers who are teaching me their language. As you can see, I am learning very slowly, so that's all the Auslan you'll see from me tonight, most likely. And I also want to thank them for sharing their knowledge of deaf culture with me. This work is only possible with you. So this evening I'll present mostly in English, with our two Auslan interpreters visible on the screen to both the live audience in the room and the Zoom audience online. I'll be showing a couple of film scenes, one with no dialogue and so no captions, and the other with captions. At the end of the talk, which will last about 40 minutes, we'll have time for Q&A. Please feel free to ask a question, share your experience, live or online. We'll see how that goes, either in English or in Auslan. And for questions online, we're using the webinar function for Zoom, where only the hosts are visible, so please type your question in the Q&A function. And for those in person, please join us afterwards for some refreshments and to learn about the ANU Auslan Club in the foyer. What role does the screen play in shaping our views of sign language? What do films and series in sign languages mean for deaf audiences? And how can they help hearing ones better understand experiences of deafness? What is the relationship between signed language and cultural identity? And how can the screen convey it in new and empowered ways? Cinema was invented at the end of the 19th century, the same period in history when sign language use was being systematically and often violently repressed in schools and public life around the world. Cinema actually has a long history of effacing the linguistic complexity of sign, of casting hearing actors in deaf roles, and of perpetuating tropes of silence as isolation and deafness as tragedy. This is despite the fact that the screen is a fundamentally deaf-friendly tool. It allows us to show sign language in motion and translate it through subtitles. And in the past decade, sign language cinema has not only exponentially grown in number, but it has also begun to reflect more authentic deaf perspectives, finally using the screen in more inclusive ways. So as Kylie mentioned, this is the first public talk that I've given since I started my DECRA project with the Australian Research Council this month, Sign on Screen. Sign on Screen is a collaboration with Deaf Community, Deaf Connect, the advocacy organisation, and the National Film and Sound Archive. The project explores the ways cinema can both obscure and reveal the complexity of sign languages and their place in the world. It will examine a range of popular stereotypes in films and series to speak back to long-held misunderstandings about deafness and sign. It will also reveal a range of new texts which challenge these misconceptions, engage in new ways with sound, and radically present sign languages as complex, complete, and empowering languages in the contemporary world. And you've probably seen a film or a TV show that includes some sign language dialogue, but if not, never fear. One of my main aims this evening is to get you taking notes, to open you up to a huge world of films, series, shorts, videos that are being made in the many sign languages of the world. As you'll learn, sign language cinemas are as old as cinema itself, but we're currently in a period of massive growth and diversification in this space, and more sign language films and series are coming out every month. So my hope is tonight will only be the start of your sign language cinema journey. You'll see two spellings of the word deaf tonight, one with a lowercase d, and one with an uppercase D. Lowercase deaf refers to a physical state of not hearing. It's a medical, physiological term. Uppercase deaf is an identity, much more linked to culture and community and use of a sign language. Not all lowercase deaf people identify as uppercase deaf or know sign language. There's also a common misconception that there is a universal sign language, but this is completely untrue. When I say sign or sign language tonight, I'm referring to a general concept like language. In fact, there are around 300 sign languages recognised internationally and many more state, community and family dialects. And if you're wondering why, just think about why there are so many verbal languages in the world. Languages grow over time as they are used by communities. Ableist rhetoric has led many to believe incorrectly that sign languages are made up, invented codes like Morse code or Braille. But sign languages are not invented, or rather all languages are invented, right? Over time, iteratively, in context, in culture. And sign languages are no different to verbal languages in this way. And a final concept to understand is audism, as well as its subcategory of oralism and their connection with film. Audism and oralism are two forms of discrimination against deaf people and sign language users. Audism is the general concept of deaf discrimination and has existed for centuries. So if you're a fan of Aristotle, you may like to just note that he was a famous audist who is quoted as claiming that deaf people cannot be educated, they become senseless and incapable of reason. That was Aristotle. Audism, which has existed for a very long time, is quite simply xenophobia towards the deaf. Oralism, however, is a specific form of audism, which is designed to repress and erase sign language. It's a pedagogical approach that bans deaf children from using sign and forces them to learn to speak, hence oralism, speech, versus manualism, sign. And oralism actually hasn't always been the norm. In the 18th and 19th centuries, first in France and later in other countries, manualist deaf schools were opened which taught and encouraged and shared sign language. But after the International Convention of Milan in 1880, a conference where hearing education leaders met to decide an oralist strategy for deaf education internationally, oralism was rolled out across the Western and many other non-Western contexts. And oralism dominated deaf education and public life from the late 19th to the late 20th century. Deaf children, including in Australia, were forbidden to use sign language in school, and some Auslan users who are still alive today describe being forced to sit on their hands in the classroom. And if you're interested in learning about this history, you can watch a short film for free on YouTube called Hand in Hand about the true story of two deaf girls in Aotearoa, New Zealand in the 1970s, Annette and Nicola, who became lifelong best friends in primary school, where they signed in secret. As explained at the end of Hand in Hand, the sign language ban in schools was lifted in most places in Australia and New Zealand towards the end of the 1970s. And in the 1980s, Auslan was officially recognised by the Australian government and the first Auslan dictionary was published. But the intergenerational effects of this language ban, which was a form of linguicide, are still felt today, and we are far from having just and even access to sign language education for deaf students in this country. So why cinema? Sign language oppression was being systematically carried out at the same time that cinema as a technology was invented. But despite this, the sensorial modalities of the screen make it an ideal tool to represent sign language. for what is sign but a moving image? Before cinematic technologies, it was actually really hard to convey sign language if you weren't in person, face to face. It's really hard to write it down and describe it with words, and it's hard to create images with arrows to denote movement. What we did have is theatre and live sign poetry, which have been some of the most beloved forms of sign language cultural expression. And then in the late 19th century, we got this tool of the screen, which conveys sign in its true form, in movement, but through space and time. And this was well understood by Georges Vidic. I'm sorry for the blurry image, but this is an absolutely crucial historical image. He was the head of the National Association of the Deaf in the 1910s and commissioned the first American sign language films. And these films are our oldest moving representation of sign language. Vidic is especially famous in the deaf world for his 1913 short film on the preservation of the sign language, which is an ASL manifesto in which Vidic claims there is but one known means of passing on American Sign Language through the use of moving picture films. And in some ways, cinema has been a unique space for deaf creators to express themselves in their languages. In addition to the National Association of the Deaf films from the 1910s, there were actually several deaf creators operating in silent era Hollywood. Think about how gestural early silent cinema is, and how the only dialogue is shown on intertitles in text. Film historian John Schuchman has researched the careers of deaf silent actors like Granville Redmond, you see on the left, who performed in multiple Charlie Chaplin films. You can see him and Chaplin signing to each other in the middle image. And he often played a hearing character. On the right, you have Lon Chaney, who was hearing, but he was a coda, or a child of deaf adults. And Chaney even credited his native sign language knowledge as strengthening his silent film acting skills. There was even a popular rhetoric at the time about the power of cinema to become a universal language, not just for deaf people, but for everyone. And the invention of the talkies at the end of the 1920s was seen by many as a kind of re-rending of the Tower of Babel, a redivision of the world back into its separate languages, divisions which could only be bridged through translation or language learning. And this re-rending, so-called, of the Tower of Babel, this linguistic proliferation of verbal languages on screen also meant the end of a golden age of cinema for deaf people. This moment is captured quite beautifully in Todd Haynes' black and white silent film from 2010, which is set in the 1920s, Wonderstruck, in which a deaf girl goes to the cinema, enjoys a silent film along with the hearing audience. However, when she exits the cinema, she sees that that shared experience is all about to change. And she sees these posters declaring, "Sound system, experience 100% all talking, see and hear your favourite actors." It's the 1920s and a rift is about to open. You may recognise Millicent Simmons, the actor from A Quiet Place. In the century since the invention of sound cinema, sign language cinemas have grown around two core concepts that I want to interrogate tonight. The first is metaphors of silence, how hearing audiences associate deaf experience with silence and attach pessimistic connotations to what it means in ways that don't necessarily resonate with the deaf. And the second concept is a tension between two different ways of thinking about deafness. The hearing-centric idea of hearing loss and the deaf-centric idea of deaf gain. So, these are the films and series with titles including the words silence or silent. There are also as many films including the words noise, music, sound. This is just silent and silence. And this includes films called Silence, 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 Silent and the Silence. We're obsessed with silence. And of course, not hearing is a defining feature of deaf experience. Though just like there are countless gradations of vision loss before you're identified as blind, and then countless gradations before you process no light or colour, there are also countless gradations of hearing loss, ranging from slightly hard of hearing to perceiving no sound. Many deaf people do interact in complex ways with sound, especially if they use hearing technologies like hearing aids and cochlear implants. Yet, as these titles show, hearing directors and audiences are very focused on the idea of deafness as silence, and very often of silence as terror. Hearing audiences set a lot of stock in what silence means, associating it with negative concepts such as isolation, unfeeling, frustration, confusion, and emptiness, which they then attach to their assumption of what deafness must be like. In their book, Deaf in America, deaf scholars Carol Padden and Tom Humphreys write of this hearing fixation on deafness and silence. Quote, "To hearing people, the metaphor of silence portrays what they believe to be the dark side of deaf people, not only an inability to use sound for human communication, but a failure to know the world directly." And cinema has played a major role in reinforcing these ideas, which are part of what Martin Norden calls a, quote, cinema of isolation. Norden writes about disability in general, and I want to note openly that many deaf people do not identify as disabled. However, Norden's idea of the cinema of isolation helps us to understand some of these cinematic stereotypes. He writes that, quote, "Most movies have tended to isolate disabled characters from their able-bodied peers as well as from each other. In the case of people with physical disabilities, the movie industry has perpetuated or initiated a number of stereotypes over the years as a part of the general practice of isolation. Stereotypes so durable and pervasive that they have become mainstream society's perception of disabled people and have obscured, if not outright supplanted, disabled people's perception of themselves. In a cinema of isolation, a deaf character is a tragic figure, cut off from mainstream society, whose inspirational arc usually involves finding some exceptional way to overcome their deafness, and if not, to tragic ends. And this was the dominating trope of sign language cinema for many decades in the 20th century. And very often in these texts, deaf characters were played by hearing actors. The first major exception was 1986's Children of a Lesser God, in which a young Marlee Matlin, who you may recognise from The West Wing, or The L Word, or Coda, became the first deaf actor to win an Academy Award. However, though Marlee Matlin's casting was an essential move forward, the film itself is a classic example of the cinema of isolation. In it, Matlin's character insists on only communicating in American Sign Language and thus separates herself from others. She's contrasted with the so-called inspiring story of the deaf students who learn to speak and then sing, taught by her hearing partner, played by William Hurt. And many, this is not all of them, many films from the 1930s up to the 2020s are fixated on this loss of hearing loss, and often they will heighten this loss by making the main character a musician who goes deaf and therefore loses their livelihood and their passion. First, we had The Man Who Played God, a 1922 silent film about a jazz pianist who goes deaf, which was remade with sound with the same actors in 1932. We've had throughout film history multiple biopics about the tragedy, so-called tragedy of Beethoven going deaf. In 1955, Liberace played a musician who loses his hearing in Sincerely Yours. Somehow that's a comedy, which is refreshing, actually. In 2004, It's All Gone, Pete Tong gave us the story of an electro DJ who goes deaf from sound exposure. In 2018, A Star is Born with Bradley Cooper and Lady Gaga shows Jack's increasing hearing loss and tinnitus contributing to the many reasons he, spoiler alert and content warning, completes suicide. However, even though many sign language films still focus on deafened musicians, we're starting to see a shift away from the cinema of isolation. We now have films like the 2020 Unsound, which is an Australian film, mostly in Auslan, in which dance music is a source of great joy to deaf community who gather together to hold raves where they increase the volume up to the max and dance to the vibrations. And in Darius Marder's 2019 Sound of Metal, Riz Ahmed plays a drummer in a doom metal duo who abruptly loses his hearing during a tour. The film explores his understandable shock and grief as he navigates hearing loss and grapples with a new life. But it also begins to explore deafness not only as an experience of loss, but as one of possibility. Not only as an experience of isolation, but as one of connection. And I'll show you a brief scene from this film now. Yeah. We'll be screening Sound of Metal at the National Film and Sound Archive on the 21st of September as part of the International Week of the Deaf for free with an all-deaf academic Q&A panel, and I'll give you those details at the end of this lecture. Now, my purpose today isn't to draw a neat line from the past to the present and to argue that things are getting entirely better. It is definitely true that there are fewer hearing actors playing deaf characters today. There are more deaf directors, writers, and advisors on set now than there were in the past. And there are more normalising and authentic portrayals of sign language use than there were before. But deaf access to filmmaking is still gatekept through financial and cultural barriers. And we still get films like the 2016 Netflix horror movie Hush, which stars hearing actress Kate Siegel the actor from Midnight Mass and The Haunting of Hill House. And they're also by the same hearing director. In Hush, Siegel plays a deaf woman who is stalked by a serial killer who is fascinated by the fact that no matter how many times he psychologically terrorizes or physically attacks her, she will not scream. And just to confirm, screaming, like laughing, is a physical and emotional reaction that all humans make, and screaming actually has very little to do with whether we can hear ourselves doing it. So we're still in a world where films like Hush get made. But we're also in a world where deaf leaders are making more films than ever before, combating these kinds of myths. And in this environment, we're seeing many examples that reject the cliche of hearing loss for the deaf concept of deaf gain. In their book, Deaf Gain, H. Dirksen Bauman and Joseph Murray describe the idea like this. To many in the deaf community, being deaf has nothing to do with loss, but is, rather, a distinct way of being in the world, one that opens up perceptions, perspectives, and insights that are less common to the majority of hearing persons. The biological, social, and cultural implications of being deaf are not automatically defined simply by loss, but could also be defined by difference, and in some significant instances, as gain. In recent years, a large subsection of sign language cinema has emerged that expresses the concept of deaf gain in exaggerated terms. And these are lucrative, widely distributed mainstream films, mostly American, and series that are seen by millions of people. Can you guess what I'm talking about? Deaf superheroes. We've been seeing deaf superheroes for a while, since the 2010s. This one, since 2022, has been on Apple TV+. It's a children's series called El Defo, based on a graphic novel for children about a young girl who adapts to her new deafness by creating herself a superhero alter ego, El Defo. And in the 2020s, some of the biggest films in the box office include deaf superheroes. In 2021, we had Makari from Marvel's Eternals, a super fast, super observant, immortal superhero played by Black deaf actress Lauren Ridloff. Eternals is particularly interesting because one of the superhero's powers is healing others. But with Makari, there is nothing to heal, because her deafness is not posited as a deficiency or a disability. And this is a common thread for many in deaf culture, who do not see themselves as disabled, especially if they were born deaf and therefore never experienced any loss. However, these images are dark. Makari is so superhumanly perceptive that her methods of communication actually risk perpetuating some other myths. In one scene where she's negotiating with some dodgy traders, she turns her back for a moment and the men mouth to each other, "Just lie to her." Makari catches them immediately, whipping back around and signing to them, as her friend interprets for her, quote, "I can sense vibrations, even the tiniest movement, including your voices when you speak." Now, of course, most people don't think this is realistic, that deaf people could read lips behind their backs. But it does feed into a widespread misconception that lip reading is always a reliable and straightforward replacement for hearing. As we saw in the Sound of Metal clip, vibrations are important parts of deaf perception, sometimes communication. For example, if you're sitting across the table and you knock to get somebody's attention. But this example feeds into the falsehood of magical lip reading. In reality, even experienced lip readers will often only be able to decipher around 30% of what is said, and that requires not only the eyes, but many contextual clues as well. Also, in the second half of Eternals, Makari conveniently decides to lock herself away to read for 500 years, meaning that there's less of a need to include sign language or interpreting in the second half of the film. Then, a year later, in 2022, as a Christmas offering on Disney+, we got the Avengers series Hawkeye, which stars the titular Archer, played by Jeremy Renner, and Native American deaf actress Alakwa Cox as Maya Lopez, who also goes by the supervillain name Echo. Like Makari, Maya has superhuman vision, depth perception, and reflexes. Like Makari, her deafness is not a hindrance, but an edge. Born deaf, she experiences deafness very differently to Hawkeye, who is starting to experience workplace-induced hearing loss due to the explosions that are an everyday occupational hazard if you're an Avenger. For Hawkeye, hearing loss is an experience of barriers because he hasn't yet learned sign. And it's a major stressor in his personal and professional life. He is experiencing hearing loss, but Maya is living a life of deaf gain. Now, far be it from me to minimise the impact of superhero representation and visibility for minority children. In recent years, we've seen the power of Black Panther for Black children, of Captain Marvel for gay children, and of Wonder Woman for girls. And in similar ways, Eternals and Hawkeye have been praised for providing powerful role models for deaf children, and that should not be underestimated. But the thing about superheroes is they're superhuman. They provide an image of perfection and exceptionalism. They're not normal. And they run the risk of sending the message that in order to be successful or valuable or accepted as a deaf person, you need to be special. And if deaf superheroes can sense the vibrations of lips speaking English behind their backs, it also risks implying that hearing people don't need to bother learning sign language. The deaf person can just bend over backwards to perceive English through exceptional means. And so the scene I want to show you now isn't from a superhero movie, but it does include a superhero costume. If you haven't been swept up in the fandom like I have this year, the scene you're about to see is from the 2023 HBO series The Last of Us, which is set in a dystopian zombie world and is based on a very popular video game of the same name. It includes the fugitive brothers Sam and Henry, who are wanted because Henry betrayed their leader to get Sam, his little brother, treatment for leukemia. Henry is hearing, and both are original characters from the game, but Sam is only deaf in the show. And in the following scene, the series' main character, Ellie, bonds with Sam over their shared love of a superhero comic with the fitting motto, endure and survive.
the settlements,
What happens?
all the rules become unaffected.
No way! I love these! Four, five, 6, 11. Edge on universe and back, endure and survive. Endure, survive. Endure, survive. Oh, yeah, man.
Keep it down, not up.
So as you see in this scene, deafness doesn't make Sam superhuman. Like Ellie, he idolizes superheroes and feels that little bit of extra self-confidence when he puts the costume on. And he's in a lot of danger, so that is of value to him. But deafness also isn't what makes Sam vulnerable. It's his age and his leukemia that mean he needs special treatment and protection, as well as the apocalypse. In other words, even though The Last of Us is set in a post-apocalyptic hellscape overrun by murderers and mushroom zombies, and even though Sam is deaf, he's still just a normal kid. On The Last of Us podcast, showrunner Craig Mazin said of actor Kevin Woodard, who plays Sam, he's incredible, and I cannot wait to see more from him. I hope that when people watch this episode here in Hollywood, in our business, that they don't just stop at the end of it and go, boy, that kid was really good playing the character of Sam. I hope that they go, that kid ought to be in a lot of things. The fact that he's deaf is a fascinating aspect of representation that is underrepresented on television. But, more importantly, his story in our show wasn't about him being deaf. In fact, the biggest factor to his character was that he had had leukemia. That was a bigger deal for Sam. And I hope that people in Hollywood think about casting Kevon again, and not in stories about being deaf, but just in stories about people, because boy is he good. The diversity of representations of different deaf experiences that we're seeing in the contemporary era is exciting, especially compared with the reductive portrayals of the past. We need more stories about deaf experience, especially ones that correct hearing misconceptions and myths and provide inspiration to young people. But perhaps the most exciting thing that's happening in contemporary sign language film and television is to finally see examples of deaf actors and characters who aren't in a film because they're deaf, but because they're a person who just happens to be deaf. We're sure to see more of this as more deaf creators are afforded access to the filmmaking world. For one reason or another, most of what I call the normalization narratives are being produced in the US, just as most of the films and series with sign language in them are coming from the US. And I'm hoping to see more normalization narratives coming out of other major producers of sign language cinemas around the world, because we also do have a lot of sign language film coming out of India, Japan, France, South Korea, and Eastern Europe, as well as Australia. But for now, if you're looking for recommendations, some existing examples of the normalization narrative are shown on screen here. Things like The Society, This Close, Deaf You, Switched at Birth, BPM, Noel, if you can believe it, and only murders in the building, to name a few. And so at this point, before I conclude, I want to come back to the theme of this lecture, the Humanities Research Centre, Future of the Humanities and Social Sciences lecture. I've done a lot of talking tonight, and I am the chief investigator on the Sign on Screen project, but no matter how many sign languages I learn, no matter how much experience I have with researching multilingualism in cinema, no matter how much goodwill and open-mindedness I bring to this work, I will never understand what it's like to be deaf, unless I lose my hearing. And I can never speak for those who use sign language as their primary form of communication, whether they do so because they are deaf or nonverbal as a result of autism, neurological conditions, or any other psychological or physiological reason that makes sign a more accessible form of communication than speech. So the Sign on Screen project is not an individual endeavour. Over the next 3 years, this research will produce an array of events and publications that centre deaf perspectives. Just this week, filmmaker, actor and writer Sophia Golan, the director of the brilliant deaf-blind documentary Imagined Touch, is beginning her PhD on the project. And she'll be working on deaf-led filmmaking and the hearing appropriation of sign language on screen. As I mentioned before, on the evening of September 21, as part of the International Week of the Deaf, we will be screening Sound of Metal at the NFSA for free as part of the Science Art Film Series, which is the HRC's collaboration with the NFSA and CPAS, the AME Centre for the Public Awareness of Science. And after the screening, we will have a roundtable with Sophia, with co-director of the Auslan language film Dry Fire, Ramos McRae, and bioethicist Jackie Leach Scully about the complex issue of cochlear implants. And I've included the link to book your free place for the screening on the next slide. And in 2025, Deaf Connect and the NFSA will support us to put on a public film festival, also called Sign on Screen, where we will show some of these films that I discussed tonight, including films by Australian deaf directors like Sophia and Ramos. And we will invite deaf facilitators to lead the Q&As. We've also, a group of students and myself have co-founded the AMU Auslan Club, where we offer beginner Auslan training to AMU students. And please also keep an eye out for the Sign on Screen website, which doesn't yet exist, but will include a full film database. And I say all this not because I want to come across as sanctimonious. I do not pretend to have all the answers, and I certainly don't expect to do all of this research perfectly. But this project has been set up so that I can't run it off the rails without accountability. And I'm finding collaborative work with community and colleagues and fellow allies and creators to be immensely liberating and energizing. We can do meaningful and helpful research on minority languages without causing harm. But it requires embracing the delicacies of allyship, cultivating a humility that doesn't necessarily square with the stereotype of the scholar in the ivory tower, and being always open to learning. And so I want to close my talk tonight the same way that I opened it, with a thank you to all who have made it possible.